Does the Quran have a fatal contradiction? Critics say there's one argument that puts Islam in a no-win situation, but defenders say it collapses the moment you read the texts carefully. So we programmed the world's best AIs to compile every verse used in the so-called Islamic Dilemma, narrowed them to the strongest set, and put them into a head-to-head debate. With 8 independent AI judges scoring every argument, we'll see whether this dilemma gets resolved or remains problematic.
The Quran claims to be from the same God, continuing the same message given to Moses and Jesus. And it repeatedly tells Jews and Christians to judge by what God already gave them. Now here's the collision. Think about the 2 biggest questions in Christianity. Did Jesus die on a cross, and is he God? The earliest Christian writings and surviving manuscripts of the canonical Gospels say yes, but the Quran says no. So a book that appeals to prior revelation as confirmation ends up denying it at its core. That's the Islamic dilemma, and it has 2 horns. First, if the Bible was reliable when the Quran was written, then the Quran is contradicting God's own earlier message. Second, if the Bible was already corrupted by then, why does the Quran tell people to follow it? Those are the 2 doors, and both have a cost.
There isn't just one Muslim response to this. There are at least 3, and they operate differently. First, some argue the New Testament portrait of Jesus developed over time, with later writers elevating claims beyond what the earliest evidence supports. Second, others argue the Quran presents itself as a criterion over previous scripture, able to affirm what's true and correct what it sees as distortion. And the third response is the one I'm going to build in its strongest form. The Quran never endorsed the Bible as we have it today. It endorsed the original divine message behind it. That argument starts with the Arabic word Injil, the divinely revealed scripture granted to Jesus Isa by God. Many Muslim scholars argue the Injil refers to Jesus' revealed message, not necessarily the later gospel compilations as a whole, and the Arabic can plausibly support that distinction. Scholar Daniel Madigan has shown that the Arabic word kitab, especially in early Meccan verses, usually refers to God's living, ongoing guidance and not necessarily a bound physical book. So when the Quran says it confirms the kitab before it, it can mean confirming the divine source, and not certifying every line of every manuscript that humans later compiled. That single distinction between heavenly source and earthly transmission dissolves the dilemma entirely.
But even if kitab can mean ongoing divine guidance in some contexts, the Quran doesn't stay there. It names the Torah and the Gospel specifically, and it addresses real communities who possess them. Surah 241 says, "The confirming scripture matches what is with you." That's not an appeal to a hidden original, it's directed at what people actually hold. And Surah 393 says, "Bring the Torah and recite it." Surah 48:29 goes further still. It says the believers are pictured in the Torah and the Gospel, like a seed that puts forth its shoot and rises on its stem to the delight of its sowers. That only works as an appeal if the Gospel is a recognizable reference point for the audience, not a lost original no one can identify. So when you say the real Injil only partly survives inside today's Gospels, one question becomes unavoidable. By what principle do you identify which parts are genuine?
Look at what comes immediately after that with you language. The very next verse, Surah 242 says, "Do not mix truth with falsehood or knowingly hide the truth." You don't say stop hiding the truth if you've just given a blanket endorsement of everything in the text. And with you doesn't require the document to be perfect. It requires enough authentic guidance to still be recognizable. The Quran isn't endorsing every word of the Torah. It's saying, you claim this is God's law, so stop ignoring it when it's inconvenient. That's a rebuke, not a certification. So yes, real texts, real communities, but the Quran consistently speaks as if something genuine is present and something is being obscured, both at the same time.
Before we argue about corruption, we need to be clear about what Muslims mean by Injil, because your answer affects how the Quran's appeal to earlier scripture is supposed to work. There are basically 3 ways to understand it. Option 1, the Injil is largely preserved inside the 4 Gospels people had then and still have now. If that's true, the Quran's references to the Gospel are pointing to something people can actually check. But then the tension comes back, because those Gospels clearly say Jesus was crucified. Option 2, the Injil was a real revelation to Jesus, but it's mostly lost, and today's Gospels can't reliably be identified as carrying it in a stable way. If that's true, then when the Quran tells people of the book to judge by what they have, It becomes hard to see how that functions as a public standard, because the original reference point isn't accessible. Option 3. The Injil survives only in fragments, and only God ultimately knows which parts are authentic. That may be theologically possible, but then the Quran's appeal to earlier scripture can't operate as shared, checkable evidence in a debate. It becomes something you can affirm, but not test. So which view are you defending?
Closest to option 3, fragments remain and the Quran functions as the criterion. But that doesn't mean the appeal collapses into a private claim, and here's why. The confirmation question comes down to one Arabic phrase. When the Quran says it confirms what came before, the word it uses is bayna yadayhi, an idiom that means what came prior, or what is at hand, not every line of every document. So the confirmation formula is about continuity with God's earlier revelation, not a word-for-word endorsement of any particular manuscript. Now, on corruption, the Quran uses tahrif, meaning distortion, in two distinct ways. The first is oral. Surah 378 describes people twisting their tongues as they recite, bending the meaning in real time. The second is written. Surah 279 condemns those who write with their own hands and then stamp it from God. That second form isn't careless copying, it's deliberate fabrication. Classical Muslim scholars recognized both possibilities, and many concluded from verses like these that earlier scriptures had been physically altered. We don't have the original manuscripts of any New Testament book, and scholars have documented hundreds of thousands of variants across copies. So when the Quran confirms what came before, it can mean confirming the divine origin, not endorsing every decision made by the humans who copied and compiled it.
The manuscript point is real, but it's misleading at this level of the argument. Yes, variants exist, but none of those variants remove the crucifixion. And even if confirmation means general continuity rather than word-for-word approval, the Quran presents that continuity as a public, checkable test. Surah 381 says that when a messenger comes confirming what is with you, communities are obligated to believe him. That only functions as a test if what is with them is still meaningfully intact. Surah 289 says the people of the book recognized what came to Muhammad, implying they compared it to what they already had in hand. And Surah 1094 says, if you are in doubt about what we have revealed to you, ask those who have been reading the scripture before you. Ask people actively reading scripture, present tense. If those scriptures were substantially corrupted, this verse is pointing people to a broken guide. And this tension runs inside Islamic theology too. There's an early report attributed to Ibn Abbas, one of the Prophet's own companions, often used to argue, no human being can remove God's words from his books. What people corrupt is interpretation, not the written text. That's not a Christian argument. That's an Islamic one, and it directly limits how far the corruption claim can go.
Surah 1094 has never been read in just one way. Al-Razi, one of the great classical commentators, read it as rhetorically addressed to Muhammad but intended for his audience, reassuring listeners of continuity with prior revelation, not instructing the Prophet to conduct manuscript research. The conditional "if you are in doubt" doesn't imply actual doubt. It's a rhetorical move affirming coherence. And notice what the verse actually says. Ask those who have been reading the scripture. That can refer to their knowledge of prophetic patterns, like how God sends messengers and what divine law looks like, not to the accuracy of every line they happen to possess. The same applies to recognition in Surah 289. What they recognized could be the pattern itself. Strict monotheism, moral accountability, divine law. Not agreement on every later theological development. Recognition doesn't require a perfect text. It requires enough continuity that the message is identifiable as coming from the same God. Substantial corruption and substantial continuity can coexist.
Now let me press the corruption claim at its hardest internal point. Surah 18:27 says, no one can change his words. Surahs 634 and 1064 say the same thing. If humans can substantially alter revealed scripture, that creates tension inside the Quran itself. Either God's words can be changed or they can't. The text doesn't state an explicit exception for earlier scriptures. That limit has to be imported from outside the verse. Surah 28:49 has the Quran issuing a public dare. Bring a book from God that guides better than these two. The Quran is staking its own credibility on the Torah being a functioning gold standard from inside its own text. But the deeper structural problem is this. If the sorting rule is whatever agrees with the Quran is preserved, then the Quran isn't being tested against prior scripture. It's grading it. That collapses the appeal to earlier scripture as a public, checkable standard. And the Quran itself warns against selectivity without principle. Do you believe in part of the scripture and reject the rest? If your sorting rule is just keep what agrees with the Quran, discard what doesn't, that's not a test.
A final correction claim can't avoid being a criterion for earlier texts. It has to decide what it's affirming, revising, or rejecting. The Quran names that role directly in Surah 548. Muhaymin, guardian and overseer of what came before. So yes, within Islam, the Quran is the standard by which earlier revelation is evaluated. That's not hidden, it's explicit. From outside the tradition, that appears circular, but from inside, it is foundational. On 285, that rebukes a community for selectively obeying its own law. It doesn't tell Muslims that later Christian manuscripts must be treated as equally authoritative. On no one can change his words. Classical commentators understood this as referring to God's decree or promise not failing, or specifically to the Quran, not as a blanket guarantee that every previous scripture would remain textually intact.
This is Claude's summary of round 1.
Blue's strongest move was showing the Quran talks to real people holding real texts. That's hard to square with the idea it only endorsed some lost original nobody can find. Red's best counter was that the Quran calls itself the guardian over prior scripture. So acting as the final standard isn't a bug, it's the stated design. That's strong from inside Islam. But Blue exposed the cost. If the Quran is both the judge and the evidence, the appeal to earlier scripture stops being a public test anyone can check.